Hello, welcome to Q&A Live. I'm your host, Stephen Drunsic. I hope you all have had a great holiday. Today we have a special show. We're going to puncture the veil of the Freemasonry, what most people think of a secret society. We're fortunate to have two special guests here today to discuss the Masons. I've got Bob Treat. Bob Treat, thank you for coming on my show today. Bob,
Glad to. Yes, good to see you again.
Your actual title is Right Worshipful District Deputy and Past Master. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Did I nail that?
You nailed it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a mouthful.
That's a mouthful.
And then on my left, I've got Steve Farrington. Thank you. You're the Grand Historian. Is that correct?
That's
for
right.
the state of Vermont.
That's correct.
Well, obviously, I appreciate you guys coming on my show today. It's an interesting topic because normally when people think of Freemasons, there's this aura of mystique that surrounds the society. But in doing some research, it's really a fraternity, a brotherhood, a benign organization who, with certain moral principles, and you try to engender a certain civic duty amongst the members. Maybe you can just give me some background on the Freemasons and starting all the way back in maybe 1390. Go way back. Can you reach that far back?
You're posing that question, Steve. They say, well, how did Masonry begin? Actually, I guess we can say it's evolutionary. Masonry goes back to even biblical times in operative Masons. Those stone Masons who actually built the temples and so forth. And then it moved on to like the ancient Greeks. And some of our instruction in Masonry harkens back to that, which we talk about the different forms of ancient or classic architecture. And then you moved on to the Roman Empire, which actually formed what they call groups called collegiums. And they would travel with the Roman troops of conquer. And when they conquered a nation, they would recruit people from those communities and taught them the skill of stone masonry, which was really encompassing of other skills as well, and included mathematics and things like that. So someone would really get quite an education, at least from a technical point of view. And then when the Roman Empire fell, and of course the Christianity grew up in the latter days of the Roman Empire, and the orders of monks took over a lot of times where the collegiums left off. And the famous group called the Comacene monks, who had a monastery on Lake Como, they were specialists in stone masonry, and they traveled Europe, continuing that training and promoting the skill of stone masonry. And of course, in one partly legend, partly history, the first Grand Lodge, they believe, that was formed of operative masonry was 996 under King Ethelstan of England. And that started formalization of Grand Lodges throughout Europe. But the time of the Renaissance, the Protestant movement, they believed King Edward VIII, in a way, was kind of responsible for this transition because for political reasons, he withdrew from Rome. He started the Church of England. And the kind of requirements, and he also outlawed or discontinued the requirement for stone masonry, as we might know at that time. And so in order for them to provide or to have more commissions, they started introducing into the lodges of stone masonry what they call speculative members, like associate members. Mm-hmm. And these men were often men of classical education and everything, and they saw with it opportunities to symbolically represent moral conduct through the rituals of masonry, and use that as a way of imparting that to other leaders of the community and give them a chance to, you might say, develop a code of conduct that was in line with what their religious beliefs might be.
So if I was to approach someone who's a Mason, now, how do you refer to a member? Is it a brother?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Typically, you don't have to be a member of a guild per se. You don't have to be a Mason. You don't have to be a bricklayer. You don't have to be a painter per se. Anyone can be a Mason, but there are some restrictions, right? You have to be 18. You have to be a man. This is a fraternity. I understand also that you have to have some belief in God. In other words, atheists, agnostics, even agnostics aren't allowed. And there's a lot of, I guess, controversy about, whether or not you are a religious organization or not. Now, you're guided by this overarching principle that you should believe in a supreme being, and yet there's no discussion, no political or religious discussion involved during your meetings. Is that correct, Bob?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And now, why is that? And there's kind of a dichotomy there. Although you're guided by biblical principles, and yet there's no discussion, religious discussion, at least denominational religious discussion. How do you circle that square or square that?
Well, I think that there's a lot of emotion when you start talking about any one religion, and people stop being I want to say they get the emotional aspect of it then takes over, and so we try to stay completely away from that.
Okay, and tell me what goes on in a meeting. One of the things that people also think about is you guys are kind of behind this veil of secrecy. You've got secret handshakes. There are code words. There are certain degrees of which you have to study for and then apparently ultimately complete. And there is this aura of mysticism. Some people have even called you a cult. There are a bunch of conspiracies out there. Of course, much of it is not founded in any fact. Can you just tell me what you do during a normal meeting? What transpires? Or what can you tell me at least?
Yeah, I can certainly. We open up with a secretary's report, and the secretary will read the minutes of the last meeting. He will discuss any information that's come in. We get information from Grand Lodge.
Okay.
He will go over requests that have come in. We will then have a treasurer's report, and then depending, we may have somebody coming in petitioning the lodge, and so we will do any petitions. Then we have activities that may be coming up. We will also have a scholarship fund. We do a scholarship for 2 scholarships usually for Burton.
Okay.
So there's
no mysterious seance going on
it's
and
just
wearing
a
cloaks
regular,
and
regular work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting.
Well, when you mentioned about what can't be mentioned in lodge or not, Bob pointed out very well about the issue on religion. Also, we don't talk about politics in the lodge.
Boy, and that seems to me to be a very difficult threshold to not cross, because politics somehow, they pervade all parts of our daily
the idea
lives.
is and one of the parts of the things we admonish our brothers when we start our meetings and activities is that we're here to meet in brotherhood and harmony. And the reason why we don't discuss, because it doesn't lend itself to harmony. But also when you talk about the requirements of Masonry too, basically there's just 2 basic requirements: is to be of good moral conduct and to be a person who has a faith in God. Now, that's a broad term, because one's faith does not have to be necessarily Christian. You could be of the Jewish faith. You could be a Muslim. If you have a faith in any monotheistic religion, that's perfectly fine to belong to it. And I guess some people have criticized this because we don't emphasize one faith. Again, that goes back to even the beginning, because early Freemasons really believed in the idea that freedom of religion was important. People should worship God or their God according to dictates of their own conscience. And one of the times when Masonry historically really gained ground was during what they call the Age of Enlightenment, which was, I believe, the period between 1600 and 1800. And this was a period of a lot of social and political turmoil. And a lot of things that men would mention in terms of sciences and everything in public.
The liberal arts. Right?
They were not favored. But in a tile lodge, in the early days, there was Masonry is kind of an intellectual forum, almost like a collegiate discussion site where they present a concept, an idea, and they would discuss the pros and cons and so forth as gentlemen. And so, consequently, among those things, they would talk about people like John Locke or Rousseau and everything who believed the idea of a government should be derived by the consent of men. And as a result of that, a lot of the basic early beliefs of Masonry reflected that, and that's why some historians believe that some of the founders who were Freemasons kind of drew on some of that basic experience and added it particularly to the Constitution as it later became written. And so these were Enlightenment ideas that, as time went on, were not necessarily ones that need to be drawn on or discussed, as it was community needs and service and that kind of thing.
Well, I know if you do some research on Freemasonry, a lot of it revolves around the founding of this country.
Right.
And obviously, Masons will point to the fact that a number of the signers and writers of the Declaration of Independence were Masons, George Washington being one of them.
Right.
A number of, I think, 11 or 12 presidents.
Yes.
Now, when you look at a $1 bill, here's one of those interesting conspiracy theories. There's a temple on the back, a pyramid with an eye, which a lot of people ascribe as a Freemason symbol, but it's actually not. Right. It's more of a symbol of the Illuminati, and we'll get to that later. But maybe you can talk a little bit about how the Freemasons had involvement in the founding of this country.
Well, certainly, as you mentioned, George Washington was probably the foremost member, but then several of the
Paul
others.
Revere,
Paul Revere,
right.
certainly. Dr. Joseph Warren was a very influential Mason. He was able to pick up a lot of information. Being an MD, he traveled back and forth between Boston and where he lived out in the countryside in Massachusetts. And he was able to pick up a lot of information, what was going on in Boston at the time, even though the British controlled Boston. Mm-hmm. And he became a master of the lodge. He became a Grand Master in the state of Massachusetts.
Now, did they have to meet in secret with the British, or did the British see the Masons as a threat, the development of Masonic culture?
Ironically, many of the British officers
were also Masons.
Correct.
Sure, because this is a global organization.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
What I wanted to mention, just when Rudyard Kipling took his degrees in India, he had all three religious books on the altar. So it's not just one. He encompassed three of them.
That's right. How did it go? He had a Muslim,
Bible.
A Hindu, and who else?
The Quran, the Bible, and the
Holy Bible. But he also had each of them each degree were his escorts that helped bring him along in the degree that represented the different religions.
Now you're saying you just mentioned degree, and that's a word that comes up a lot. There are 3 degrees, right? There's an apprenticeship, a Freemason or a fellow.
Entered apprentice.
Entered apprentice. Well, I'll let you. I don't want to
well,
mix this up. Or
why
maybe
don't
you
go
can
ahead
tell
on
me.
that.
All right.
And how many degrees do you have? I presume you have all 3 of them?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Well, maybe just a little bit of basic organization of
Yes.
Freemasonry here in the United States.
That would be helpful.
We start out with local lodges called blue lodges.
Okay.
And you have to join a blue lodge in order to.
Now, why is it called a Blue Lodge?
Go
Does
ahead.
it have to do with the color?
Yeah.
And then
Well,
seen
it's
as
the color is symbolic. It goes
okay.
again. It goes
Exactly.
back to the earlier times. Blue was the color of honor and moral upstanding, and so to be in the Blue Lodge, it's presumed then you're a person of upstanding. You're upstanding in your community, and you're of good moral standing in that community. So, as a consequence, being symbolic of that, it became referred to as the Blue Lodge, as being the place where you stand in a sort of an aura of honor and in that regard. So they refer to it. Again, it relates to sky because it relates to heaven.
Okay.
And heaven being also symbolic of
The importance of symbolism.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So you got a Blue Lodge.
And in that, you take 3 degrees.
Okay.
First degree, second degree, and third degree. Then after that, there's a way called the York Rite
Right.
or the Scottish Rite. And so you can picture it like a Y, where you take the first part and then you go up one ladder or the other.
Or both, some do.
Or both. Some people, actually right now, I went the York Rite to begin with, and my work wouldn't let me travel out of Manchester very much. I was on call a lot, and so I put most of my time in the local lodge. But I did go through and up the York Rite, and when you at a certain point, then you can become a member of the shrine.
Okay.
And now I'm taking the degrees in the Scottish Rite, and there's 32 of those.
right?
Well,
Okay.
33, but you don't earn the 33rd one. That's
Okay.
that,
That's the
you
grand
have to-
poobah, right?
that's
Or the-
right.
That's
That's
what
an
they call an award degree.
honorary
Gotcha.
degree, and it has to be given to you. You don't earn it. Yeah.
How much can you divulge with respect to what goes into a degree, or what a degree encompasses in terms of the educational aspects or the learning aspects? Are you learning about the history? Are you learning about how to elevate to a certain desired person in terms of character, in terms of moral development? How much can you elaborate?
Well, the 3 degrees represent a number of things, but the 3 degrees also can represent the stages of life: youth,
Okay.
middle age, and also older years, which in a sense being the 3rd degree presumes that you now are at a stage of being wiser, more experienced as an individual, or as a stonemason would have been. But also remember that early stonemasonry went through a similar process. And to illustrate the degrees, let me go back to the stonemasonry just a little bit. Now, it would assume that a young man who wanted to learn to be eventually a master, actually the master mason originally was not a degree. You went only as far as a fellow craft, there's 2 degrees. You became a master mason if by give it as a responsibility. You were the master mason of a job. You were like the head architect, the head engineer. And the original Masonry Grand Lodge of England started off with only 2 degrees, but as they inducted men of nobility, they thought, well, it'd be more distinguished to have an additional degree. So that became added on, say, around 1723.
Okay.
Now to go back to the degree process as it was done in the Middle Ages, you might start at 15 or 18 on your process to learn. You start as an apprentice. You'd be kind of the grunt work, but you also at the same time be taught all the rudimentary and basic details that require to being a stonemason,
Okay.
including the math, the engineering, the artistry, even all the mental work, everything else that goes with it. Say by the time you're in your early 30s, maybe even earlier, you might be looked at as being experienced, prepared enough, and you have proficiency in all the skills necessary to be a fully successful stonemason, and then you'd be passed to a fellow craft, or a journeyman, as we might call it today in the trades, and they would have like little ceremonies of transition, and they would be taught a certain catechism and a certain handshakes. Now, the reason for that is that they would be traveling masons. They may travel around Europe. Mm-hmm. And they didn't have in the Middle Ages a union card or anything like that. So you hear through the word of mouth a job is being done, some work, and you look for the job. So you come on the job and you look for the master mason. And he interviews you. And first he shakes your hand. Well, the way the hand is shaken indicates to the
Certain
master
level of
mason,
status or a-
that's
a
whether you're an
degree
entered
having-
apprentice or whether you're a fellow craft or what have you. And then he will ask you, interrogate you with certain questions. And those questions will determine your proficiency and skill level.
Depending on how you answered them or types of words that you use,
Yes.
perhaps?
There's another aspect that's kind of interesting if you're getting into the history of it is, to me, back at that time, two things. One, people were not really allowed to leave the town they lived in. If I wanted to travel to Dorset, I would go to the select board and get permission to go to Dorset. Well, that was cumbersome. If they had a cathedral or a castle they were building and they needed these people, you couldn't send out word on email or any of those things. So once the word was out, these people had to feel free to leave.
There you go.
And so they were able to travel without permission. If
Because of their special skills, their...
Well, if they could prove they were a Freemason, then they were allowed to travel from France to England or to Germany and go through all those towns.
And is that where you get putting the word free in front of Mason? The ability to freely move throughout society, or
Actually, it
move
has
from-
two meanings. What Robert did said is 100 right on. That's number one.
Okay.
Free to travel. The second one was that you weren't an indentured servant
Right.
or a slave in any way. So you're required to be both.
Right.
And that's where the
Free
free
man.
came. Yeah,
Free
free
man.
man.
Man,
Free
of
man
which you have
and
to be in
free
order to
travel.
become a
Right.
member. Obviously, it says that in your eligibility guidelines.
The other thing that I think is important, there were no schools, and the people that were starting in and learning these trades had no other way to make a living, or you didn't go to college, you didn't go to school, and not only that, they helped if there was an accident. So they took care of the people that were in there in the association. And this was all over Spain, Portugal, Germany.
So it's kind of like the first union.
Exactly.
There you go.
It
There you go.
got it right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And going on from what Bob says, he described it very well. But that was one of the first things when Freemasons evolved more fraternally, is they carried on that tradition to also help members who might need some medical help, or their families had some difficulties, or what have you. So it also became, as brothers, as a fraternity, it was an opportunity to help each other who might be going through some bad times. And it was a continuation of that process.
A lot of monks, as Steve mentioned earlier, were involved in Freemasonry, and it was really a source of education. People could improve themselves, and by degrees, which is what happened as you got better and better.
But I'm trying to historically understand the apprenticeship trajectory, actually working in a craft, working with stone. But today, for the most part, most of your brothers are not actually working with that craft. So it's representational. Okay, so let's maybe expand on that, because...
Well, and Robert probably can add more to this, but let me just simply say that the symbolic idea is that when you become well, you said it today earlier. Oh no, I guess Mike said it. One of the mottos or lines of Freemasonry is that we help to make good men better. So by that, when you become a Mason, symbolically we say that we help to build up our character. We help to make better people. So instead of being temples, structures, physical structures that we're building better human beings, helping each other by helping them become better individuals, more generous, more open, improving their character and this kind of thing. So instead of building stones, we're building people in a sense.
And you had when we were kind of doing this pre-interview before, you did mention the Boy Scouts and the
Right.
merit badges, and so there's
Right.
kind of an analog there.
Right.
That's maybe a good way
Exactly.
of describing it.
Exactly.
Earning these merit badges in your process of in life, helping to make you a better, more whole person.
Back up just a little bit. When people wanted to become Masons, which gets into what Steve was just saying, they had to have quality character. And having this freedom to suddenly travel throughout Europe with no obstruction, if they turned out to be robbers or thieves, the penalty was very great. It was some form of death back then, so that they didn't get a tarnished reputation and lose the ability in any country for their men to travel back and forth, because it was so important on a time basis, building a castle. They needed all these people, and so they were very strict about the quality of person that they got.
Well, to add on to that, kind of touch upon the secrecy aspect of two reasons for secrecy, one of which Bob kind of alluded to here, because when they were on the job, they would have perhaps people of importance, leadership roles. They might be wandering through the construction area. They might be talking to one another about different things that perhaps were not a good idea to be said elsewhere. So each of these men, Masons, had to be ones who could, in a sense, be kind of deaf. They weren't ones who could carry tales, or gossip, because they had to be trusted as individuals on the job. The second thing was that because they felt these skills of stonemasonry were not, today they're sort of common. I mean, mathematics, and certain aspects of engineering, but to be able to keep the trade intact, and without a lot of people to say they're might come and say they're tradesmen when they're not, they had to keep the skills in secret, so that not any Tom, Dick, or Harry could come on the job and say they're a Mason.
Right.
So the element of secrecy was started then, and was carried out over fraternally as a tradition, but also it's that aspect of secrecy to keep the degree work, the passwords, the handshakes, and these things secret, is what kind of makes Bob and I brothers, because we share the same knowledge, but we have the same understanding, but because it's a test of our veracity, it's a test of our character, not to divulge this. Now, however, if someone off the street were able to witness all this, they'd say, well, why does this have to be secret? But it's because, again, it's a test of our character to do so, that we continue that tradition of the secrecy of those areas.
Touching on a couple of things you mentioned. One was the first degree is duty to a supreme being, a creature to his creator. The second is duty to your neighbor.
Yes.
And the third is duty to yourself. Mm-hmm. And this is very similar, as you well know, to Scouts. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned something about that earlier, all the forming members of Scouts when they started in England were Masons, except Baden-Powell. And his friends tried to get him to join the lodge, and he decided not to, because at that time the Pope was opposed to Masonry, and anybody that was Catholic could not join the Masonic Lodge. So he was afraid that if he was a Mason, then there would be an edict that Catholics couldn't join Boy Scouts.
And that's because the Pope, of course, being Catholic, felt that Freemasonry ran against church doctrine. And that's because there was more of a humanist aspect to Freemasonry versus a very strict doctrinal aspect.
But it also goes back to the Reformation period, the Age of Enlightenment, when all these different denominations are being formed, and that philosophically, because again Freemasonry believed in the freedom of choice of how people worship God and what denomination they should embrace, and Catholicism being the dominant denomination at that time, it started kind of a tradition of being opposed to Masonry because they didn't emphasize any one particular
It's
religion.
funny because it seems like every major religious denomination has some beef with Freemasonry. The Methodists, the Protestants, the Catholics, the Greek Orthodox.
No, not necessarily.
Well,
And that may...
you're right in the sense
I may
that
be overemphasizing that. It does, you may come across that in some literature here and there. But, and that's, I think, strictly a result that...
And ironically, we can cite historically where there have been priests, particularly in South America. There is a number of priests who have become Masons, though technically Rome isn't supposed to know that. But in recent years, last 2 or 3 decades, the restrictions for people, Catholics, becoming Masons has not been as strong. Forgive me. Before Pope Benedict, there was Pope John, who's just
John Paul, Ratzinger?
No, before Benedict, he was, but Ratzinger became Benedict, but just before him, he was being made a saint. But he was a little bit less restrictive on it, and so it became a question. Like I met a brother down in Boston who was a member of a lodge down there, and he indicated that his daughter got a scholarship from the local lodge, and he went up to the master lodge and said, "Well, it's too bad your Masonry doesn't let Catholics in." He says, "You do a wonderful job." He says, "No, that's not true." And he gave him some information and everything else. But he said, "I want you to go and see your parish priest to talk to him about it before coming back and talking to me again." And he said, "If you have his leave to become a member," he says, "we'd be more than glad to entertain your membership." And he did. He went to talk to him, and the priest was concerned about his fulfilling his church obligations, and they went and everything. And once he was satisfied with that, he said, "Fine," and he was able to join. But it evidently at this time or at that time it varied by parish, depending on who was the head of the particular parish and everything else, and it tends to vary. But again, it goes back historically that simply because we don't emphasize any one religion, and
sometimes, excuse me, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that a lot of people say we're a religious organization, and we certainly aren't. Religion is certain religious aspects, but we're not a religion, definitely not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's just that I think we might allude to, basically Christian ideals
For us,
as
yeah. Other
as
countries
a
maybe
basis for philosophical, the golden rule.
Right.
That seems to be universal among many peoples, even those are not Christians necessarily. And so in that regard, philosophically, we embrace certain ideals that might come from religion.
Can you tell me, you've got an interesting motto and some symbolism in your pin that you have.
I don't
Can you
have,
tell
I have
me
my
exactly,
pin on, but he has
exactly what goes into that and what that means? I see, is it a rule?
One is the compass,
The compass?
one is the
And then
square,
a square?
and
Of
then
course,
the
they
letter
can't
G.
see that, but
Yeah, I don't know if they can.
everyone
on
can
that.
look that up
Yeah.
fairly quickly. And what do those individual elements symbolize?
The letter G has a couple of meanings, but I guess basically it would be God.
Okay.
And then the square and compass is to keep us within the due bounds of life with fellow man, with your all your interactions, and there's a
Do I say moral bounds, so to speak?
yeah, and there's a lecture that goes along explaining what each one does specifically.
Okay.
But this is to remind us that that's the oath we took.
That's right. And again, it's tied in again with moral conduct, and and even for that matter, as it relates even to law. One of the, though we talked about the Age of Enlightenment, one of the obligations we have to have is that we follow the law of the land, and that we stand as upright people before our government, before law, as citizens, and as well as morally.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say,
Steve.
why do you think conspiracy theorists out there think that Freemasonry is part of the Illuminati? A group of elite thinkers that are controlling the levers of power in the world. And where do you think that comes from?
Well, actually, in a way, Illuminati was at one time part of it, but it was formed separate from Freemasonry. It only lasted 10 years. I think it lasted from 1775 to 1785. Mm-hmm. It was formed, now check me out on this, I think Adam Weintraub, who I think was Austrian, I believe. And he believed that it was important to form an elite group of individuals who, through their education, experience, and everything, would be wiser, more knowledgeable in terms of leadership than anyone else, and should eventually become the ones who would control governments. And so they formed initially the secret society of the Illuminati with the goal of infiltrating a variety of governments in Europe, take this over. But at this point, by 1770s and everything, Masonry developed a very high level of involvement. And so they saw that because a lot of community leaders, government leaders were already a part of Masonry at that time, they saw it as an opportunity by getting involved in Masonry to be the vehicle to accomplish what they wanted to do. However, that was easily and soon discovered. And so by 1785, 10 years into this, not only did different governments or monarchies of Europe, but also the Grand Lodges, the different European countries discovered this and outlawed the Illuminati, and basically put them out of business.
Because they saw it perceived as a political threat, or a threat to their power base,
I'm not sure of that, but
some organized threat.
I think, at least for here in the United States, when George Washington was president, there was a move to have him become a Grand Master of the colonies, of all 13 colonies. And he refused, just like he refused to be a king. He said no. And it evolved that, he didn't think it would be good to concentrate all that power in one area. So it evolved that every state has their own Grand Master. And that Grand Master runs that state. Now there's Grand Masters, are associations that they do a lot with each other. But the Grand Master of a state like New York or Texas doesn't have any say over a small state like Vermont.
Is the power structure democratic, or is it an appointment base? When you say Grand Master, how does one assume the role or title of Grand Master? Is that an appointment by some?
No, you work your way up through a series of degrees.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
You start in our lodge, for example. You start in as there's several what we call chairs, and you start in at the lowest chair. We have a chaplain, and then we have secretary, treasurer, and there's a series of chairs, and usually you take one chair for a year or two, depending on the lodge, and you work way up through, and you learn all the aspects of the degrees in doing that, so that then you're ready to become a master of the lodge. Pardon me?
Meritocracy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then if you're, I was a district deputy. The Grand Master can't get around the whole state, so they designate each district to have a representative, and it's more so in Texas or New York or something like that. So there, he has to have a representative, and so you assume his duties in your area. And then as you do that, then you may decide you want to get into the Grand Lodge. And the Grand Lodge is very much like our local lodges in that you work your way up through a series of chairs, and until you become Grand Master.
I was reading about the Grand Lodge in New York City is quite an opulent
Or,
lodge.
or the or the
Or is
local lodge, yeah.
the local
Actually,
lodge?
there are 4 lodges, I think, in New York City alone. And I don't know,
There's
St.
a
John's.
throne and gilded and gold, and
Some of
kind of
them are,
runs counter to the whole concept of temperance and prudence, so to some degree, no?
Yeah, again, and if you want to see another opulent facility, go to the Grand Lodge headquarters in Philadelphia for Pennsylvania. And they're one of the largest Grand Lodges in the country. But again, a lot of it is materials and things that were handed down from styles of representative furniture that represented authority of that particular time, the 1700s, for example. And again, masonry being tradition, being evolved a lot in history, parallels to the history of the country and everything. And people who are involved are a lot of members are history buffs and relate to masonry in that regard. So, so the facilities probably may have been like that for ages, simply because it reflects a former time.
I think a lot of lodges take on the culture of where they are, like you're talking about Philadelphia, and it may be a little more opulent. We have friends that are Masons. They come over. He and his family come over and visit us, and in England, you go to a lodge in a tux, or at least a tie and suit and jacket. And over here in Vermont, it's not that way. You may come in
more
in
Spartan.
dungarees and a
Sure.
and for him to come over and to have us take him to some of our lodges, he was absolutely
Eye-opener, I'm
flabbergasted.
sure.
Yeah, it was a
Well, what's
whole
interesting
different culture
too,
for him.
past Grand Master Edward Wildblood had a signet ring that they gave him when he went to visit in England, and on one side has his initial W. Then he flipped it over and it became a square and compass. So that goes back in tradition when they were more secretive in the community, and so they kept this one side. Then in the lodge, they would flip it over and have the square and compass on it. But what's interesting too is that in England, it's more traditional. The Grand Lodge officers, particularly the Grand Master, happens to be the Duke of Kent, who is a cousin of Queen Elizabeth. And when I don't know if you're part of that delegation, but I remember Most Worshipful Edward Wildblood told us that when they were visiting over there, they happened to go to a kind of an outdoor barbecue type of thing at one of the homes. It was a very nice home and everything, and everyone was in sports coats and everything, including the Duke of Kent. And he wanted shaking hands and talking and everything else. And you wouldn't think he was part of the nobility in any way. And so Ed asked him, why did he become a Freemason? Why is he active so much in Freemasonry and everything? He said, the opportunity to do this. He says, wear the sports shirt and to mingle with people like this, to go out to the community and visit
Gives him
other
an excuse.
Yeah, so he says, I don't have to be always very straight-laced and royal all the time. And he said, I prefer that.
Now, I mean, just talking about today contemporaneously, numbers back in the middle of the 20th century, I think in New York alone, there were hundreds of thousands of Masons.
Yep.
Is that the right way to refer to members?
Yeah.
But numbers have been on a substantial decline. The demographic is aging. Why is that? Do you think there's going to be, maybe a concern nationally and maybe even globally
Well,
about
there's
declining
just a couple of
brotherhood,
things.
or?
As I mentioned earlier, the Masonic institution helped take care of a lot of its members, and people would go to old people's homes. Now the government has taken over a lot of the functions that Masonry used to have to do.
Okay.
Taking care of people, senior citizen homes,
That's right.
education. You got colleges, all the colleges, and even local colleges, community colleges, where nobody needs to go to learn how to improve themselves. So a lot of those traditions are gone.
Well, it's true, and also Masonry contributed to that because they did back in the 1800s started some colleges around the country. They helped influence the Greek fraternities in the colleges, but S. Brent Morris, who's executive director of the Southern Jurisdiction for Scottish Rite, he's kind of a Masonic scholar, and he's also a mathematician. And he's done some surveys and studies compared to some of the 1800s, the age of fraternities. You had tons of fraternities being formed, a lot of them modeling after Masonry. And he took and studied many of them over the years. And he found, other than maybe fraternities like the Elks, for example, and so forth, many of them kind of went big climbs and then fell off quickly. But Masonry over the years has kind of been like this. And by the end of World War, well, I forget, I think internationally there was something like 66.5 million members worldwide, I think about just after the World War II. And of that, the United States had something like 4.2 million. Unfortunately now, in the United States, the membership is half of that. And there's a big increase in membership about the time of the Second World War. And many of that World War II generation has passed away, of course, since then. And we have been, it used to be you had to ask to be a member. And one of the reasons why, again, just going back to secrecy, that Freemasonry was in secret is because Masonry believed in being modest. We were the silent fraternity. We did our good works and quietly and without trying to ask for a lot of personal recognition. Right. And in the last 2 or 3 decades, Masonic Grand Lodges around the country are starting to realize that in order to attract membership, we have to do things like we're doing right now, talking about what the fraternity is, sharing its history, some of its ideals, and explaining what it's about, and also talking about some of the things that people do, some of the things that are done in the community. And we are starting to find a start of an upsurge. Some jurisdictions now are starting to find that as some of the older members do pass away, the difference between loss and gain is starting to diminish. So you're reaching an equilibrium point. Massachusetts now, through their campaign, Benjamin Franklin ad we call it, they put it on TV and everything else, has actually been increasing lately each year. Mm-hmm. We're noticing in Vermont, it used to be the average age to become a member, particularly after people got settled in their careers and everything, was around 50 or so. We're finding, like in my home lodge in Bradboro, the average age of new members coming in is between 28 and 30. And a lot of them are responding to the things you see on the History Channel, reading the book Da Vinci Code, National Treasure. These things have gotten them curious, and they've already, because they have the internet and they have other things out there, they've been reading about Masonry ahead of time. And so that's been seemingly that seems to be attracting them to an interest to becoming a part of it.
We now can. It used to be that we had to be 21 before we could join. Now it's lowered the age to 18, and we just had a young man join in November.
Okay.
That it's just had his 18th birthday. He's still in high school, but he wanted to join so that when he went to college, he'd be able to attend colleges and any fraternities in college. So he wanted to work his way through.
Great.
So we're seeing a little more interest in younger people. The other thing too is a lot of our lodges are not in the computer age.
Yeah.
And so many kids. There's a lot of I guess I'd say challenges for people's time, more than there was.
Sure. And attention.
Yeah, and the sports activities, for example, with all the development of sports activities and watching Super Bowl this weekend or this next weekend, and all.
We spend far too much time in front of screens.
Right, and these are drawing younger people, let me put it that way, away with the competition for their time. And so I think it's something that we're trying to become aware of.
I think it's a noble effort. Unfortunately, we have gone through 55 minutes
Oh.
quickly. Just one thing real quick. Myth or fact, the number 33 on a Rolling Rock bottle, Freemason symbol or not?
I have no idea.
I have no idea.
Look it up.
either.
It's out there.
Is it out there?
And then how about, can we do a quick secret handshake?
No. Pray not.
He could blur it out. Okay, all right. Well, Steve, Bob, I appreciate you coming on my show.
I appreciate you having us.
Sharing
Yeah,
not really
thank you.
secrets, but just some valuable, insightful information on we're the organization in our community right here in Manchester. And thank you for joining us for another hour of Q&A Live. I'm your host, Stephen Drunsic, and we will see you next time.